All right. You know what? I'm just gonna start our welcomes right now. While people are still coming on. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Darren Kalniak. I'm the professional turf and landscape sales rep with the Even Spray and Chemicals. I'm excited to, this is my first Zoom meeting to host, so bear with me if we run into some technical difficulties. We'll definitely try to get them corrected and going from there. Um, at the end of today's webinar, we do have CEC points that are available for Manitoba and for the people in Northwestern Ontario. At the end, there will be a quiz that we will send out to the people from Ontario to fill out. It's a true and false questions quiz. To this way, the IPM Council can see that you guys have taken the virtual seminar here. So also today, this seminar is going to be recorded as well. And for those for us, we can at least send out the webinars to you at a later date if you're looking to watch it once again. So we'd like to thank Brandt for sponsoring this for this webinar. It's very great of them to have Dr. Kaufmann speak at today's seminar. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kaufmann, who is with Brandt Consolidated. Dr. Kaufmann, I'll let you go from here.
Thank you very much, Darren, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's been a while since I've been to in and around the PEG, so I hope everyone's healthy and doing well there. It's amazing now. It's been 2 years of these virtual meetings, so hopefully one day we can get together in person again. I just want to start by saying I hope everybody enjoyed the Winter Olympics and the curling specifically. I tease my friend Doug Pottinger and colleague that usually I know it's a slow night when I'm tuning into curling on television. And Doug, interestingly, Doug's wife was on the Canadian Olympic curling team some years ago.
Right.
I tease Doug and all of you that are curling fans, but thanks again for having me here today. I'm just going to turn my video off so you don't have to look at my face the whole time here. And so what I want to talk to everybody about today is nitrogen and potassium fertilization strategies, talk about sources and rates and timings. Really, I'm going to focus on the fall timing and specifically talk about strategies that can be used to improve plant vigor heading into the fall, and then providing the best opportunity for healthy turfgrass the following spring. I understand the difficulties and the challenges associated with the winters in Manitoba. And while I won't be talking today about strategies for dealing with snow mold or ice damage or crown hydration, some of these nutrient inputs in the fall can have an impact under a typical winter weather pattern for the following spring. And then I will touch briefly on how some of these pest nutrient interactions can occur and what pathogens to consider and what strategies you can use to help develop more of an integrated pest management approach by considering some of these either nitrogen, potassium inputs, in addition to, and I will touch briefly on secondary macro and micronutrient inputs as well. So thanks for having me. I look forward to the talk today. I thought it was important just to point out that before you design or develop any kind of fertilizer program, it's important to start with calibrating the equipment that's going to be used to make that application. It might be broadcast equipment for dry fertilizer. It might be a spray rig. Calibrating at the beginning of the year, ideally, and perhaps even multiple times per year, depending upon how often the equipment's used, is going to be important because you want to make sure you're supplying the optimal amount of nutrient per area. We want to avoid luxury consumption on the high end, and we certainly want to avoid loss to the environment as well. So we're looking for efficiency. And selection of the correct source rate and timing of the application. I mean, you go into developing the programs, you spend a lot of time developing the programs, executing them. So making sure that you deliver the right amount of nutrient per unit area is going to improve the nutrient use efficiency. It's going to limit loss to the environment. And overall, then this is going to have a very positive economic impact on the operational costs. So these are things like, timing a nitrogen application at the wrong time where there's heavy rainfall, which could occur later in the season, or the plants are not actively growing. You can lose that nitrogen to the environment. Choosing highly efficient foliar fertilizers might be another strategy there as well. So just make sure we calibrate the spray equipment before making those fertilizer applications. So with respect to nitrogen, I thought we would just review the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen occurs in 4 main pools: atmospheric nitrogen, you have organic nitrogen in the soil, there's ammoniacal and urea nitrogen, there's also nitrate nitrogen. And you can see the processes by which these pools of nitrogen are converting from one form to the other. This is largely why we don't have a soil test parameter or measurement for measuring nitrogen in the soil, because it's constantly changing and cycling depending upon the temperature of the soil, the extent of microbial activity, the amount of fertilizer we're applying. So some of the key things here is to understand that plants take up nitrogen in 2 forms, either nitrate nitrogen here, which is negatively charged, or ammoniacal nitrogen down here towards the bottom. Generally speaking, fertilizer is applied as ammoniacal nitrogen or urea. One of the things to keep in mind with respect to urea applications is that volatilization can occur generally at a pH of 7.3 and above. So for example, in a spray tank solution with urea, if that pH gets much above that, you can end up losing nitrogen to the atmosphere through the process of volatilization. Microbial activity is important for converting a lot of this organic matter nitrogen, which can be unavailable in the soil, into plant available forms. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the issues with nitrate nitrogen is that it can be readily leached. As you can see here, it's negatively charged. So as you know, soil colloids are negatively charged. So an anion or a negatively charged compound will have a tendency to leach through the profile. So that's sort of the nitrogen cycle. And so you understand sort of how nitrogen is moving both atmospherically and then through soils, and its availability to plants. But plants need nitrogen more than any other nutrient. You find it in the highest quantities and percentage in the tissue of any other nutrient. So it's critically important, as you know, and it's going to be a big topic today with respect to not just what it does for plant development and when to apply it and how much, but also the amount of nitrogen that you put out in a given year is going to determine how much the plant consumes, how much of the other nutrients both in the soil and applied as fertilizer consumed, because the more nitrogen, the more the plant grows, the more the demand will be for other nutrients. So this is a chart you guys have probably already seen or seen before at one point. You know, now I don't want to get, there's no magic number, but typically nitrogen will be about 3 to 5% dry weight in plant tissue. You can see the chart here on the left. This is growth rate and over the course of a given season. And as you are aware, cool season grasses, creeping bent grass, annual bluegrass are going to require more nitrogen when they naturally grow more, which is in the spring and in the fall. So, and particularly if you look at this, there's a difference between root and shoot growth. So, you know, you really want to apply that higher dose of nitrogen, maybe even some that has some slow release nitrogen in the time frame where plants are producing the most roots. That way there's a greater chance that nutrient will be intercepted by the plant. So that's typically when you'd be applying the higher dose of nitrogen. And then in the summer months, when the growth slows down, that's when you would probably use more foliar applied nutrients. For annual bluegrass, for example, you know, that particular species produces a very shallow root system in the summer months to begin with. So, you know, that's when the topical, frequent, soluble, low dose nitrogen approach works very well to supply the plant, not just nitrogen, but other nutrients as well. And then we'll talk about fall, where, you know, at some point here, where is this break? Like, where do you break off applying soluble nitrogen versus insoluble or slow release nitrogen, which you can apply later in the fall, and it will sit there pretty much over the winter. The plant's not going to use it in the fall. It should be available to the plant the following spring. As we look at the literature, I just go back, you know, 10 years or so, you know, fall, and this is a study back in 2013, Dr. Schlossberg at Penn State found that fall and early spring putting green growth decreased linearly with later nitrogen application rates. So essentially, it makes sense that the later you apply the nitrogen, the plant's slowing its growth, so it's not going to use as much of that nitrogen, and thus the growth is going to slow. If that's soluble nitrogen, you need to be concerned because it may not be around the following spring. That's when you want to consider more of a slow release source later in the fall. Interestingly, too, they did, in the same study, they looked at Primo Max or trinexapac ethyl applications, so a gibberellic acid inhibitor, and found that there was that timing significantly interacted, the nutrient timing interacted with Primo. So late trinexapac ethyl applications reduced early spring shoot growth as much as 20%. So it's important to consider, obviously, if you're applying nitrogen and you're still applying plant growth regulators, that plant's going to consume less of that soluble nitrogen applied. So you might end up losing some later in the fall or through the winter. So consider that as you, you know, develop your fall strategies for this coming year. In a study back in 2016, it was found that nitrogen fertilizer that was applied up to mid-October generally would increase color and quality prior to winter, so that fall, while the benefit of a mid-November application was not apparent until the following spring. And in that same study, and from what I've seen both through science and also anecdotally or based on observation, is that low dose frequent approach to nitrogen throughout the course of the entire season, let alone strategies in the fall, makes very good agronomic sense, both during the course of the year, but also when you're putting things to bed in the fall. So when we think about then what that's going to look like throughout the course of the year, you know, generally you'd be applying, and I have all of my units here are in English. I apologize for those of you that use metric, but 0.1 pounds per 1,000 square feet every 7 to 14 days of soluble nitrogen. As I had said earlier, I think it's important to avoid soluble nitrogen too late in the fall, particularly higher rates. And you'll see why here in a second, based on some of the work out of Wisconsin and Dr. Soldat. Supplying small amounts, and when I say small, I would say anywhere from 0.1 pounds per 1,000 square feet up to maybe 0.25 or 0.2 pounds. Mid-fall, so early to mid-fall would be, now this will vary based on the location, but I would say probably even early October for you in Manitoba would be a good target for when that kind of final hit. I say a small amount, but that's still, that soluble dose probably mid-fall is the last timing for that. Because it's important to remember that after one hard freeze, you really want to back off that soluble and program. The plant's not going to be, as the plant begins to shut things down, obviously it's going to slow its growth. So a lot of that nitrogen you apply, if it's soluble, is not going to be used by the plant. And then you would use an insoluble source. There are a variety of sources to choose from. Organic sources are probably one of the most popular sources to dormant feed. And that would be nutrient available to the plant the following spring. So work from the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Doug Soldat. This was work looking at, back in 2015, nitrogen uptake efficiency in different times throughout the fall. And what they found was that, as you can see, there's greater uptake efficiency in September, and it drops off pretty dramatically moving into the middle of October. So this is a dry soluble source. So it's something to consider. Again, that's why I kind of thought that for you there, pretty similar to Wisconsin climate, I would say. So you'd probably be looking at sometime in, early October where you'd begin to wean off the soluble end. Now, of course, not only is it vary from course to course and maybe even locations within the course, but also just keep in mind that the season, each season can be different. So we don't want to necessarily do things strictly based on calendar date. We just want to have a rough idea, and then we can tailor things and customize based on the way the season's going. But we do want to have a good idea as to the amount of nitrogen that we want to apply in a given season, and there are a lot of considerations to that. But that's one of the things we do want to keep in mind. So I would suggest not applying more than 1/2 pound of soluble nitrogen after September 15th. Supplying that low dose frequent amount of soluble nitrogen until the end of the growing season. And that again would be sometime when you get that first hard freeze. And as I said earlier, I think one of the things that scientists now are looking at in this area is moving away from a calendar-based approach and more to like a climate and soils. You collect data and make those applications based on a sets of environmental data like temperature, evapotranspiration, and soil organic matter. Those might be just a few, but that's something to look forward to in the future as we move forward. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, the nitrogen approach. Although I do want to show you this picture, which was taken in March of 2005. I really like this picture because it shows just what low dose frequent approaches of nitrogen throughout the course of the growing season could potentially do as a function of lessening the chance for winter damage. So this picture was taken in the spring. The nitrogen that is greener in color there was the area that had received nitrogen in small doses every 14 days throughout the previous year. The turfgrass around it did not. So, I know every winter is more or less harsh, and so it might have been a typical winter. And but I thought it was a really interesting piece of observation by Dr. Micah Woods, who was at Cornell at the time, Cornell University. I thought it'd be important just to show you this. This is from Oregon State. As you can see, Dr. Clint Maddox shared this slide with me as it relates to microdochium patch management, and he looks at alternate strategies other than fungicide. And so in this case, nitrogen applied at 0.1 pounds per 1,000 square feet every 2 weeks offered some level of additional protection from microdocium patch. Both of these plots were treated with 2 pounds of iron sulfate per 1,000 square feet every 2 weeks as well. The only difference was the top plot was treated with nitrogen, and the bottom one was not. So you can see the difference there as well. In addition, over the course of his research, he found that 0.1 pounds every 2 weeks was better than 0.2 pounds every 2 weeks. And I had this question before about nitrogen, and I'll talk about anthracnose here in a little bit, which again is a low nitrogen disease. And so you want to apply more if you can, particularly soluble, low dose, frequent applications. There are diseases where you can apply too much soluble nitrogen as well. So brown patch, yellow patch would be an example of that, where if the plant becomes too succulent, you can run the risk of increased disease pressure in other areas. So that's another reason why the soluble, because you have more control that way. If you're applying it frequently at a lower dose, you're not going to end up with, let's say, a flush of growth or a large release of nitrogen that then could exacerbate or lead to disease issues in other areas. Okay, so we'll just move here to potassium. Again, it's a macronutrient required by plants, probably in about half the amount as nitrogen. And a lot of potassium is relatively slowly changing states. A lot of it is unavailable or stored in as part of primary minerals, feldspars, micas. It slowly begins to move to more of a slowly available form of potassium, and then finally into what would be considered readily available for plant uptake. About only 1 to 2% of the total potassium is available, because 90% of that potassium is exchangeable. So it's on the soil colloid. It's sitting there in the soil, but it has to be exchanged with other cations before it moves into solution. So you got about 10% that is actually in solution. Interestingly as well, potassium is highly mobile, both in plants and in soil. So it will, as a cation even, so as a positively charged ion, it will be readily leached during high rainfall events, on putting greens or areas of the golf course that have very high hydraulic conductivity or perk very well, which is what we want on a golf course, right? We want good drainage. So that's something to keep in mind as well as it relates to potassium. And yeah, so obviously there are a lot of different sources of potassium that you can apply. And there's been, we'll just show you here. We know that potassium is important for plants. Potassium functions from a plant metabolism standpoint. It functions for osmoregulation, allows plants to maintain better turgor pressure and better cellular hydration, if you will, particularly under prolonged cold temperatures. It helps reduce intercellular freezing. Also, it helps buffer that freezing in the late winter when the dormant tissues begin to rehydrate. But that's, a bigger issue there, of course, is just if you do end up with freeze thaw events. But in Manitoba, I'd suspect that, things go to bed. That's in Pennsylvania, where I live, we get a lot of this. And that's where you can get rehydration of the crown or ice damage and all this kind of stuff. So, but potassium is important for that. But interestingly, there was work done by Dr. Frank Rossi looking at potassium applications in the fall, and he found that increased the snow mold incidence with no turf quality improvements. And there's been other work looking at potassium where they haven't really seen a whole lot of benefit, or even in this case, maybe a negative. And then I got to thinking more about this, and in that study, they applied, 2-3 pounds in the fall of potassium per 1,000 square feet. So tremendously high rates. And so I was looking at some other research I want to share with you today, which I think is going to shed some light on what that dose should look like and what that timing should look like with respect to potassium applications to help with fall performance and following spring performance. And again, it's going to be that low dose frequent approach throughout the fall with nitrogen. You might look at a 1 to 0.75 ratio. You might look at 1 to 0.5. It just depends on the course and on the soil test report. So I'm going to show you this study on looking at potassium source and rate effects from Rutgers University back 2012, 2015. This is a very interesting study. I'm not going to talk today about the source, but rather I'm going to talk about the rate effects. So what they did was, this is a long-term study, 3 years, where they applied anywhere from 1 to 4 pounds of potassium per 1,000 square feet per year. And they made the applications May through November, 16 split applications for, again, a total of 3 years. And what they found was that in March, after all this potassium being applied or not, the plots that received no potassium had on average 58% turf damage compared to plots that had received any amount, the keyword there being any amount, which had anywhere from 2 to 4% damage. And by April, in the K treatment, all of the turfgrass had recovered compared to still being 32% damage in the no potassium treatment. Now, the important take home here is that the lowest rate of potassium was sufficient to provide protection against winter injury. And that was at 1 pound of potassium per 1,000 square feet per year. So that's not a whole lot. And we'll get into an exercise here in a few minutes where we will look at a soil test report and we will consider the amount of nitrogen that we're going to target applying, so we can predict how much potassium the plant's going to use and then how much we have to replenish the soil with. And you'll find that what I would consider to be pretty standard numbers that I see quite often for potassium, you'll end up applying maybe about that much per year. And again, the best way to do it is through foliar fertilization in that low dose frequent approach. And this also then corroborates sort of what I just mentioned, and perhaps that, like in that study that Dr. Rossi did, yeah, if you apply 2, 3, 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet in the fall, maybe that can lead to problems. But in the situation where you're going out, you're spraying routinely nitrogen or other things, 7 to 14 days, just put potassium in there and you spoon feed that as well. So why is this important for turf managers, particularly potassium? Well, one of the things that you probably don't have a whole lot of issues there in Manitoba with sodium problems. I don't think irrigation water quality is a huge issue, although we can discuss this later if you want. But in general, plants don't distinguish between potassium and sodium. So if potassium levels in the soil, and that would be using a Mehlich-3 extraction method in parts per million, are greater than, potassium is less than sodium, then you need to build up that soil potassium reserves to get to that 1-to-1 ratio or higher for potassium. And in the process, you can certainly apply plenty of foliar potassium to make sure the plant has an adequate amount for metabolism and for vigor. As I mentioned earlier, potassium is readily leached. Potassium is very important as a perhaps potassium phosphite source for added anthracnose control. Again, this is not a fungicide. It's just simply one component to a nutritional IPM strategy. And then, as I had mentioned earlier in that study from Rutgers, a low dose, sorry for the typo there, low dose and frequent applications of potassium throughout the year should offer some protection to fine turf grasses from winter injury. Again, given a typical winter climate in Manitoba. All right, so I'll get back to potassium here in a second, but I do want to touch on just some secondary, just to kind of put a bow on all the nutrition. I don't want to leave the other nutrients out here, so because there's also some very interesting nutrient pest interactions for these nutrients. When we did work looking at foliar fertilizer formulas and uptake efficiency, we found the biggest differences between those that were amino acid complexed versus those that were not, or let's just say synthetically complexed or chelated, with respect to the secondary macro and micronutrients specifically. I mean, for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, not as big a deal, but for the secondary and micros, it was. So to further, enhance efficiency in choosing the correct source for those nutrients, a foliar fertilizer is a great way to approach it. Rarely are you going to see calcium deficiencies. However, I think it's important to consider sulfur, which kind of sometimes gets neglected, and also iron, particularly at higher pH. Remember that at high pH, now above 7.5, 8, a lot of the micronutrients and phosphorus become unavailable. Calcium is also relatively immobile, so if you're relying only on root uptake, there may not be as much or sufficient amount in the tissue. So, you could apply foliar calcium. You could also do some tissue testing, which will help you determine if there's adequate calcium in the plant tissue. Perhaps a combined approach would work best. And, where there's low light, kind of in the fall and even in the spring, I think these micronutrient applications are really important for turf color and vigor. Even magnesium, as you know, which is the central atom in a chlorophyll molecule, is important for color. So you will get a color response when you apply micronutrients, as you know. And that will help with vigor, I think, all year, but also when the sun angle goes down and there's less photosynthetically active light capture. And then there's also some pathogen nutrient interactions. Again, I'm borrowing some slides here from my good friend, Dr. Maddox at Oregon State. Again, these plots now have all been treated with a 1/10 of a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet every 2 weeks. The only difference between these plots is that they are increasingly being applied with iron sulfate, up to 2 pounds of iron sulfate per 1,000 square feet every 2 weeks. So the take home here is that by increasing iron sulfate, we will see a reduction in microdochium patch. Again, this would be considered one component to an integrated approach, similar to anthracnose, where it's the sum of all of the parts, the cultural practices, everything else that you're all your inputs that are providing the very best level of control. And as you know, microdochium patch becomes an issue probably spring and fall, where you've got cool, wet, damp weather. Perhaps it can be an issue. So another, and this will be my last slide from the work by Dr. Maddox, is that a combination of elemental sulfur and, in this case, PK plus, which is a potassium phosphite source, there was a significant interaction where you can see the combination is significantly better than the sum of each individual part there by itself for reducing the incidence of this particular disease. Interestingly here as well, as you can see, rolling also had an impact on disease severity. So by rolling, we can perhaps add a little bit more, I don't want to say control, but certainly a reduction in disease severity. All right, just quickly now, some soil test considerations. As I mentioned earlier, you can test the irrigation water. Oftentimes, if the irrigation water is not great, it'll transfer over to the soil. So just something to consider if you haven't done it before and wanted to test it. I mean, there's potential issues there that could be corrected at the source if you're also having issues on the golf course with soil chemical problems. pH is important. Impacts microbial activity, it impacts solubility of nutrients in the soil. If you're going to conduct a soluble paste extract, you would only really do that to look at salinity or sodium issues. You really don't, it's not necessary to conduct a soluble paste extract for nutrients, because that's what's available at that moment. The better bet's using the Malic 3 extraction method, and you can see maybe some ratios you'd want to target. There's also the soil testing laboratory, which I suggest you use the same lab each time. They will interpret the results and give you an idea as to how much nutrient should be, they'll tell you how much nutrients in the soil, and then perhaps how much you should be applying. And yeah, so I'd mentioned this about soil pH, salinity and sodium, and then nutrient inputs. So yeah, all things to consider. You know, I like to think of soil testing as a rough guideline. You know, the traditional way that it's been done, and I think that equally as important is your observation. And as I had said before about, you know, numbers and making applications based on calendar dates, don't want you to get caught up. I wouldn't get caught up in, you know, specific numbers, although there may be some exceptions, which which I'll talk about here. But rough guideline for soil test reports. Here's a slide just showing you again that these minor nutrients, the solubility goes down as the pH goes up. So if pH is an issue, and you can acidify in various ways, but you have to look very closely at the buffer capacity of the soil, because that's going to determine how much neutralizing agent you need to apply just to get to a point where you can actually reduce the pH of the soil. So that's a whole nother topic, but just keep in mind that you're going to have to routinely apply foliar or granular, but hopefully more foliar nutrients if you're working with the high pH soils. Phosphorus is a big one, as you probably know. There's a pretty narrow window where phosphorus is available, pH 6 to 7. Again, 6 to 7 is where, and actually you don't even want to be at 7 really. You'd like to be anywhere from 6 to 6.5 really. You want that soil to be slightly acidic, and I think that's going to provide the most nutrient solubility, but also, and most importantly, offer microbial activity to be the very best, which is really important for organic matter breakdown, nitrogen cycling, and release of organic bound nitrogen. And that's just going to be the healthiest way to promote, you know, the best way to promote a healthy soil. If you do have sodium issues, you need to use gypsum, or make sure you've got plenty of soluble sulfur in the soil, because once you apply gypsum here, the sodium is exchanged with the calcium, but you need this form of sodium, which is sodium sulfate. That's the leachable form. Then that's what you leach through the soil, either by natural rainfall or by irrigation. And you know, that's just, again, salts. The way to deal with that, if you got high salt, is to leach it, to get it out of the root zone. So I did talk a little bit about soil testing. Now I just want to give you an example using what we call the minimum level of sustainable nutrition. This is an approach that was developed by our friends at Pace Institute, Larry and Wendy Stowell, plus Dr. Michael Woods. And it's based on a foundation of nitrogen supply. And its goal is to provide recommendations for nutrient applications, which are just what the grass needs. Again, not applying too little where you end up with less vigor, and not applying too much where you end up with luxury consumption. And I just want to give you an example here today as to what this exercise might look like. Some of you may have already, you know, adopted this approach. Some may know folks that have. I just thought this would be a good way to give you an example. So the goal here is to determine if an element needs to be applied as fertilizer, and if so, how much. So here's an example of what that guideline might look like. First of all, if it does need to be applied, does the fertilizer addition, and that's part of it, is does that fertilizer addition affect turf performance? So we want the fertilizer applied to affect turf performance. And that's how they came up with these soil guidelines. It's a study, and they collected samples all over the world from high performing turf. And then how much is going to be based on the nitrogen inputs. So this would be essentially a set of guidelines for pH, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So keep in mind here, potassium, we'll just use that as an example, is 37 parts per million. We want to be at or above that number in the soil. One of the assumptions associated with this approach is that we have to determine what that expected amount is going to be in proportion to nitrogen for these other nutrients. So potassium would be required in the highest amount, approximately half of what nitrogen would be. And then you can see the others, phosphorus, calcium, and then magnesium and sulfur. So if we're expecting 4% nitrogen in the leaf matter throughout the course of the year, and that's obviously going to vary. Half of that would be expected to be potassium, or 2%. Keep that number in mind. So here's the example then. We get a soil test report back with Mehlich 3 being 80 parts per million. We plan to apply 4 pounds of nitrogen annually, okay? So yeah, there's more than what we need, but we have to account for what the plant's going to use, and that's why we're interested in the amount of nitrogen. The MSLN guideline is 37 parts per million. We've just talked about the assumption that the grass is going to use half as much potassium as nitrogen. Okay, so it's going to use, if we're applying 4 pounds of nitrogen, we're going to assume the plant's going to use 2 pounds of potassium. And then we have to account for the volume, the depth of the soil. And that's what this next factor takes into account. Based on that 2 pound requirement, we're going to assume that 66 parts per million of potassium is depleted from the soil. Now that's just a conversion factor. You can get that conversion factor if you go to the website and look a little bit more closely at how this is done. Anyway, that's the conversion factor. We end up with 66 parts per million potassium depleted from the soil. So to keep it at the guideline, we have to be at the amount that is going to be depleted plus the guideline. So we're going to be required. So in this case, 103 parts per million, or 3.1 pounds of potassium, are going to be required. But we already have some in the soil, remember? So the way that we determine how much is needed is we take the amount required, subtract what's in the soil, and then we end up with the amount needed as fertilizer, okay? We could probably set up a spreadsheet and do this. I do this longhand because that's still how I do things, but I hope this makes sense for everybody. Anyway, that's about a pound needed, in this case where you've got 80 parts per million on the soil test report, okay? So, but before, and I had mentioned this with respect to calibration, it's also important to understand that healthy, vigorous, plants are going to be more receptive to fertilizer application. So before we, get into in developing your fertilizer program and all this other stuff, how much do we need? You got to set the table with all the cultural practices, utilizing all of your options, promoting adequate air-soil water ratios, drainage issues, make sure we have plenty of morning sunlight, use history as a guide for disease and other pest management problems, using nutritional or integrated pest management, bumping up mowing heights under stress, thatch management, including aeration, top dressing, fertilization, and water management. So all these things are going to set the table for plant health and turf vigor, and that's going to add to healthy plants will use nutrients that you apply, your inputs, more efficiently. And I had talked about nitrogen applications, slow, frequent low dose applications. That actually can be part of a thatch management approach, because thatch management is looking at both accumulation of biomass and how much is removed or diluted via sand top dressing and aeration. So by controlling the amount of growth or the biomass production, you are essentially or indirectly, it's one component to your thatch management program, which is another reason why controlling the nitrogen low dose frequent approach is a good one. You guys have probably seen this, sand top dressing. Again, this really promotes plant health and reduces stress. The more top dressing that goes out, you end up with the crown deeper in the plant, deeper in the root zone. That crown is protected. You guys might go out and put sand out in the fall to protect the crowns from winter injury. Same kind of concept here, where you're just, not to mention you've got the playability improvement by the fact that top dressing improves the surface characteristics. But again, that deep tillering is going to really reduce stress because it essentially raises the effective height of cut. You can get faster greens or whatever, the target is or the goal without having to appreciably lower the mowing heights. I mean, you guys are already doing enough. Like, it's the pinnacle of horticulture, mowing these plants so low, reducing their photosynthetic activity because you're cutting the grasses so low. So yeah, this is a really, really important point here, because you don't have to stress it out by lowering the heights even further to get that really nice, consistent ball roll, I guess, is really what you're looking for, not really speed as much. That's for the members to be concerned about. But anyway, that's really important. So really, as I said at the outset here, foliar fertilization is great in the summertime where there are issues in the soil perhaps, or limitations with plant growth and root growth specifically in the summer. You can correct nutrient deficiencies with foliar applications as well. You have better control. You won't end up with flushes of growth. Those are the important aspects. And foliar uptake is related to two main things. One is the size and the charge of the nutrient and its complexing agent. So on the left here, you see a chart showing that as the molecule length goes up, the mobility goes down. So that's important. And that's also important because some nutrients are actually bigger than others, like calcium, for example, has a larger diameter. So that's going to take a little bit more time to be taken up by the plant. But we have found that it will be taken up effectively over the course of 10 hours, but it's that initial uptake that's a little bit slow. And then the other here is you look at the right-hand side, the charge is important. This is what's called an ectodesmata, which is a nano channel in the leaf. This is a cross section of the leaf, and there's negative charges within this channel. So anything that's positively charged will have a tendency to get bound up in that channel. So with complexing agents designed to be formulated with nutrient as foliar fertilizers, it puts that nutrient into more neutral position, which facilitates uptake. Here's the work we did at Nebraska some years ago, and this just shows you what I just said, which is that magnesium and calcium start out slow at about an hour, just under 40% uptake, and then over the course of 10 hours can reach up to above 60% for calcium, magnesium. That's largely due to the size of those nutrients, the diameter of that atom. So in a nutshell, foliar nutrition is efficient. It's got maximum safety. In other words, they're designed to not have issues with phytotoxicity. That's not phytotoxicity. This picture was taken at a golf course on Long Island in the summertime where it's pretty dry. And performance. That performance means that you get the same amount of uptake each time. They're consistent. I think consistency is what I mean by performance there. Darren, do I have a few more minutes here just to talk briefly about some pest interactions?
Yes, you do.
Okay, great. So I want to wrap things up just by touching on anthracnose management specifically, and probably more so because that's, as you know, a stress-related disease. The more stress, whether it's water stress or whether it's heat stress or not enough nutrient or whatever, you're going to end up potentially, if you've got the right set of circumstances environmentally, and you've got, you know, a susceptible host like annual bluegrass, you're going to end up with more disease. So by priming the cell, okay, plants can do this naturally, or they can be forced into it in some ways. To prime the cell means to enhance the tolerance to abiotic stress, which should allow turf managers to, you know, another tool in the toolbox to lessen disease severity. And what we do at Brandt, and have done over many, many years, is look at, and I've said integrated pest management before. I think for Canadian golf course superintendents, it's very important. You know, you all are limited with what, you know, maybe you can apply as, you know, chemistry for pesticides, if you will. So we look closely at utilizing all the options, developing thresholds, environmental safety, but specifically, how do we combine the chemicals, maybe use less chemicals, and combine that with cultural practices, specifically nitrogen fertilization in the case of anthracnose, and phosphite, specifically potassium phosphite applications. So in the past year, 10 years or so, you know, we've come up with what this integrated approach might look like, or at least providing golf course superintendents with one component to the integrated approach. We're stressing nitrogen and potassium fertilization, also phosphites, and using lower label rates of, in this case, you'll see the research is using Daconil Ultrex. You can bump it up to a higher rate if the pressure gets really, really high. But generally speaking, you can use these programs with a low label rate of Daconil Ultrex. And, you know, the question came up over the last couple years, could we, if we reduce the stress or even further, essentially using a stress tolerance enhancer, could we further get better disease control? Again, Rutgers University, this actually ties back beautifully with what I showed you with respect to the soil test report and how much potassium you might need to apply. Remember that you have to customize this based on what's going on in the golf course. So what might work as far as inputs go for one superintendent with, you know, newer bent grass greens versus older push-up and annual bluegrass greens could be very different. So this work found that when the potassium level in the soil went up, there was less disease. They found the critical value, this is a correlation where with an R-squared value, you know, 0.7 up to 0.8, where 50 parts per million or 50 milligrams per kilogram in the soil using a Mehlich 3 extraction method was sort of the critical value there. So we would want to keep then, you know, if you look, remember the old example, the example using the minimum level of sustainable nutrition, that was 37 parts per million. If you've got a push-up greens with annual bluegrass, you had a history of anthracnose on the golf course, that's where you want to bump that number up. And in this case, you'd want to be at 50, okay? In addition, they looked at tissue test and found that as the tissue tests went up, potassium in the tissue went up, so the disease went down. So similar inverse relationship as with the soil potassium. And the cool thing here was that they found that it was 2% actually that was that critical value. And as if you recall, when we went through that example, and these totally separate, if we're targeting 4% nitrogen, we expect 2% tissue K. There you go. That's where you want to be. Now, this is also going to require you to tissue test. So for those of you that really want to, you know, pin down and get real detail oriented, you can tissue test and kind of really see where you are. And that can be a helpful tool for you. If anthracnose has been an issue, you want to keep that tissue K above 2%. Maybe it means you apply a little more nitrogen too. We looked at one technology called Megalex. If you just want to I'll set this up for you. We have a percent anthracnose on the y-axis here. Notice the high level of disease control, disease pressure in the untreated. We have a base program, which is a foliar fertilizer applied at 12 fluid ounces per 1,000 square feet, and a phosphite, and then Daconil Ultrex at 1.8 ounces per 1,000 square feet. We were interested, we added this product Megalex, which enhances stress tolerance at 7.3 fluid ounces, if that would reduce disease, and we saw a significant difference there. So with this product, we were able to, and this is a product that works within what's called the lectin cycle of the plant, and actually allows plants to produce more net carbohydrate. Some of that carbohydrate can be used for root growth. Other can be used for as in storage as non-structural carbohydrate, which can be used as energy currency under stress. So that's sort of how that works, and we saw a reduction in disease. At Penn State, 2020, in this case, we looked at a couple of base programs, a Grig base program and a Brandt base program. And what we did was we added a product called Turftopia, which has osmotic adjusters and also a powerful antioxidant in it. And what we found was, if you look at the rating date on the 14th of August, and again, notice the high level of disease pressure. It didn't matter which base program, you know, foliars, fertilizers, plus phosphite, either the Grig or the Brandt. When we included the stress enhancer in there, the Turftopia, we saw a significant reduction in disease. So we were pleased with this result. Now, of course, this is still very, even this low level of the Grig program plus the Turftopia was still at 15%. So it's not complete control, okay? But, and also I do want to point out in this case, we used 3.2, so a higher rate of Daconil Ultrex. But again, we're seeing a significant reduction in disease. That was our primary goal, was to look at what effect this Turftopia would have, okay? So just wanted to point that out. And we always look at too the and here's just a shot of what those plots look like. You might consider this to be, but it's still, you know, got some disease in there because we had such a high level of pressure on this particular site. This site always gets hammered, and we always look at a nutrient control as well. In this case, urea. And you'd expect there to be better color in this plot on the left versus the fungicide alone, because this has nutrient in it. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up my prepared remarks for today. I think in conclusion, it's important to consider the basics. I talked about that earlier. You can also quantify some of this stuff. Like if you measure volumetric water or firmness, you could determine sort of in a quantitative way what inputs you're putting out, whether it's nutrient or top dressing or whatever, what effect those are having on real playability parameters. So that's something that you might want to consider. I would suggest that spoon feed approach of both nitrogen and potassium throughout the year, specifically in the fall. But, you know, again, shutting down high rates of nitrogen, probably sometime mid-fall, like early October for Manitoba, and then just spoon feeding until that first freeze. You can improve playability, no question, with foliar fertilizers. I talked about that today, reducing biomass, controlling the growth, just having good color quality consistently, focus on the correct pesticide fertilizer solutions and certainly calibrate, explore nutritional IPM programs, consider the research that's being done out there, and rely on that where you need to. I do understand this is part art and part science. So, you want to pay attention to the science, but you also want to pay attention to what you're seeing. I think that's really important. I said that before on the soil test, like using it as a rough guideline and your observation being important as well. You can fine tune programs for efficiency further with choosing the correct nozzles, for example. There'd be another way to fine tune things even further. And with some of these programs that I mentioned towards the latter part of the talk, you can start small if necessary. And then as you become more comfortable, you can get a little more aggressive with it. So again, yeah, that's the end of my prepared remarks. Darren, I don't know if we have time for any questions, but I'd be happy to take any if we do.
Yeah, sure. We'll open up the question time here. As I kind of mentioned, if there's any questions, just type them up in the chat area, and we can have Dr. Kaufmann answer them. I just want to thank you, Dr. Kaufmann, for speaking at today's seminar here. It was definitely a pleasure listening and hearing all the great research that's going on. And I know you had a couple points about wondering what our pHs are, especially in Manitoba. We definitely have very high pHs, kind of in the closer to the 8s. And a lot of water quality is pretty poor as well in our area. So just for information for you, so you have that for whatever you need.
Good. No, that's good to know. I figured that might be the case, but I've been there only one time, and we visited a few golf courses, but yeah, I don't recall having that conversation, and I just wasn't sure. So then yeah, that means that some of that information should be helpful for folks.
Okay, so we do have a question here from Rob. Just to clarify, the source of K is not critical?
So that's a really good question. The source of K does matter. It does change the efficiency level, particularly when it's applied to the soil. But my point was that in that Rutgers study, I was only reporting the information about the rates, not the source. So they did find some interesting results based on the source. They looked at, potassium sulfate, potassium chloride. There were some others in there. I just wasn't reporting it today. But yeah, I would not say that it's not important. I didn't mean to say that. I do think, again, though, that the topical foliar applications of potassium will be extremely useful for turf managers moving forward throughout the growing season in the fall.
All right. Any other questions from the attendees here? Okay. Give it a couple seconds.
I hope I didn't offend anybody with my comment about curling.
I think you explained everything so well that that no questions are needed here today. So congrats, that was fantastic. So
Curling's just another reason to drink beer, Gordon. They love to drink beer.
Well, I look forward to my next trip to the Peg. I did have a really good time there a few years back, and very hospitable.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and nice to see you, Chris.
Great presentation. A lot to think about.
Thank you.
And I'm always available, and I rely on Gordon a lot. Obviously, there's a great wealth of knowledge there. I thought that, some of that research towards the end is using some other tools, Turftopia, and they're going to have Arthur speak to him here shortly too. So,
oh, great.
Yeah. So,
well, that's good. Arthur will be we'll drill down quite a bit then on the Megalex technology that I briefly talked about it, but yeah,
yep,
that's good. Great.
Great. Getting some guys starting to use that and really starting to see the results. So especially in the upper Midwest. So
great.
Anyway.
Well, I wish everybody a good rest of your winter. I hope you get to enjoy the snow here for a while, and then yeah, good luck in 2022. And thanks so much.
Thanks, Gordon.
Appreciate it.